Now we're going to get started on section 8.7 and finish up the chapter. We're going to begin with the brain. There are 6 major regions of the brain: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata make up the brainstem, and then the cerebellum. The major structures of the brain: the cerebrum is divided into paired cerebral hemispheres. Deep in the cerebrum is something called the diencephalon, and the diencephalon is divided into the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The brainstem contains the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum is the most inferior posterior part of the brain. This is the superior view of the brain. This is the cerebrum, and you see the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, and you see it separated by the longitudinal fissure. This is a side view of the brain, and key things to make note of is the frontal lobe of the brain, the parietal lobe of the brain, occipital lobe of the brain, temporal lobe of the brain, and that's of the cerebral hemisphere, and then the cerebellum, and then the medulla oblongata, and last but not least, the pons. This is a side view of the brain cut in half, and you're able to see again the frontal lobe, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, the cerebellum, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Remember that the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata make up the brainstem. This is what we'll be looking at when we do the sheep brain dissection. Remember that the ventricles of the brain are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. The 2 lateral ventricles within the cerebral hemisphere drain through the intraventricular foramen. The 3rd ventricle in the diencephalon drains into the cerebral aqueduct, which goes into the 4th ventricle, and that drains into the central canal in the spinal cord. This image shows you the ventricles of the brain: the lateral ventricles, the intraventricular foramen, the 3rd ventricle and the cerebral aqueduct, and then the 4th ventricle and the central canal. The cerebral spinal fluid is really important. It surrounds and bathes the exposed surfaces of the central nervous system. It floats the brain. It transports nutrients, chemicals, and waste. Remember that we said a good night's sleep is important because it removes the waste out of the brain, and it helps remove the protein beta amyloid that we all produce. It's continually secreted and replaced 3 times per day. This is showing you the 3rd ventricle, 4th ventricle, and central canal, and that's the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, the cerebrum, it contains an outer gray matter, and it's called the cerebral cortex. The surface of the cerebrum folds into gyri, and it's separated by depressions called suci, or deeper grooves called fissures. The cerebral hemispheres, they're separated by the longitudinal fissure, and we have the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. Now, there are different lobes of the brain. The frontal lobe, it's the anterior part of the brain. The temporal lobe is the side of the brain. The parietal is the upper posterior part of the brain. And then the occipital lobe is located most posteriorly. Each of them has specific functions for the regions. The frontal lobe has the primary motor cortex. That's where we have movement and skeletal muscle involvement. The parietal lobe has the primary sensory cortex and has certain sensations. The visual cortex is in the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe has the gustatory, auditory, and olfactory cortexes. The occipital lobe has the visual cortex where we have vision and sight. Then the temporal lobe has the gustatory, auditory, and olfactory senses. Gustatory is taste, auditory is sound, and olfactory is smell. Now, one of the things we need to look at is the association areas and how do we coordinate responses of integrating sensory and motor cortexes. The somatic sensory association area helps us recognize touch, whereas the somatic motor association helps us coordinate movement. This just shows you the different parts of the brain. You see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now, a few other things. The right and left hemispheres of the brain are linked by something called the corpus callosum. Now, there's a couple other areas that we need to know about. The higher order centers. The general interpretive area is called the workings area, and that integrates sensory information to form visual and auditory memory. And the Broca's area, or speech center, that regulates breathing, vocalization, motor skills needed for speaking. Now we're going to go into each of the lobes and what they tend to do. In the frontal lobe, it coordinates information from the entire cortex. So these are skills such as predicting timelines, making judgments. It also deals with feelings such as frustration, tension, and anxiety. So those are frontal lobe skills or feelings or functions. So again, the frontal lobe functions and skills and feelings include predicting timelines, making judgments. The feelings include frustration, tension, and anxiety. There's something called hemispheric lateralization. You've probably heard of left brain and right brain. Well, the left hemisphere tends to be involved in language, skills, analytical tasks, and logic. All right, let me say it again. Language, skills, analytical tasks, and logic. The right hemisphere tends to be involved in analyzing sensory input and relating it to the body, as well as analyzing emotional content. This shows you the illustration, the left side of the brain, the right side of the brain, and it shows you right-handed and left-handed and how the corpus callosum communicates with both sides of the brain. Now, what's called an EEG, or an electroencephalograph? It's a printed record of the brainwave activity. Modern techniques include using PET scans, MRIs, and they allow extensive mapping of the brain's functional areas. This shows you, for example, a person being wired for an EEG. There's something called alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, and delta waves. Now, there's types of memory. Fact memory recall bits of information. Skill memory is learned motor skill that can become incorporated into the unconscious memory. Short-term memory doesn't last long unless rehearsed, and converting to long-term memory through memory consolidation. And then long-term memory remains for long periods, sometimes an entire lifetime. And then amnesia is a loss as a result of disease or trauma. Make sure you know these because we're going to have a vocabulary quiz on these later on. There is something called the limbic system. It includes the olfactory cortex and the tracts between the cerebrum and diencephalon. It also establishes the emotional states, and it links the conscious with the unconscious, and it also aids in long-term memory with the help of the hippocampus. This shows you where these are. Now, the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made of three areas: the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. It contains the switching and relay centers, and the centers integrate conscious and unconscious sensory information and motor commands. The epithalamus lies superior to the third ventricle and forms the roof of the diencephalon. The posterior part contains the pineal gland, and that's very important. It's stimulated by light, and it's part of the endocrine system, and it secretes melatonin. The thalamus has a right and left thalamus and are separated by the third ventricle, and they're the final relay point for sensory information. Finally, we have the hypothalamus. This lies inferior to the third ventricle, and it's subconscious control of skeletal muscle contractions. It's usually associated with strong emotion, It also adjusts the pons and medulla functions and coordinates the nervous and endocrine systems. Now, in the hypothalamus, it secretes hormones. It produces the sensations of thirst and hunger. It also coordinates the voluntary and autonomic nervous system function, regulates body temperature, and it coordinates the daily cycles. The midbrain contains various nuclei. And what it does is it has reticular formation, is a network of nuclei related to the state of wakefulness. The pons links the cerebellum with the midbrain, diencephalon, cerebrum, and spinal cord. So the pons is basically like a relay center. It also contains the sensory and motor nuclei for the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. The cerebellum has an automatic processing center. It adjusts postural muscles to maintain balance. It also has programs to fine-tune movements. So it's very important in coordination and balance. Ataxia is a disturbance of coordination, and this can be the result of damage to the cerebellum. The medulla oblongata connects the brain with the spinal cord. Make sure you know that. That's a test question. It also contains the sensory and motor nuclei for cranial nerves number 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. It also contains reflex centers. It also contains the cardiovascular center, so it adjusts the heart rate, and then the breathing rhythmicity center, so it regulates the respiratory rate. This just shows you the thalamus, and then they show you the diencephalon with the thalamic nuclei, the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata, and last but not least, the spinal cord. Here we see the posterior view.